안녕하십니까. 오늘 그 키노트 강연의 사회를 맡은 계명대학교 최진실이라고 합니다. Hello everyone, I'm Jinseo Choi from Keimyung University, moderating today's keynote lecture. 네, 먼저 시작하기 전에 휴대폰은 무음으로 혹은 진동으로 바꿔주시기를 부탁드리겠습니다. 그리고 국문 채널은 1번, 그리고 영문 채널은 2번입니다. 네, 지금부터 잠깐 Kirsten Malmkjaer 교수님의 양력을 소개를 해드리겠습니다. I would like to introduce Professor Kirsten Malmkjaer briefly. Kirsten Malmkjaer 교수님께서는 영국 버밍엄 대학교, 캠브리지 대학교, 미들섹스 대학교, 레스터 대학교에서 강연을 하셨고요. 그러니까 교수를 역임하셨고, 그리고 지금 현재는 그 영국 레스터 대학교의 번역학 교수로 명예교수로 재직 중이십니다. 네, Kirsten Malmkjaer 교수님께서는 일상생활에서의 번역에 늘 관심을 가지셨고, 그리고 일반적으로 그 언어 인식, 그리고 국제 관계, 그 다음에 문학과 다른 텍스트가 어떤 식으로 국제적으로 통용되는지에 늘 관심을 가지고 계셨습니다. 그리고 특히 번역학에서는 Kirsten Malmkjaer 교수님의 이론인 번역학 문체라는 그 이론이 굉장히 많이 통용이 되었고, 저를 비롯한 많은 후학들이 현재 논문에서 활발하게 쓰고 있습니다. 네, 그 외에도 교수님의 연구 분야는 안데르센의 그 번역이 어떤 식으로 되는지에 대해서 늘 관심을 가지고 계셨고, 지금 현재는 캠브리지 대학교에 나오는 시리즈 중에서 캠브리지 엘리먼트 시리즈가 있는데, 특히 통번역 분야의 그 캠브리지 엘리먼트 시리즈의 에디터로 지금 활동하고 계십니다. 최근 출판하신 저서로는 번역가 창조라고 하는 책이 라우틀리지에서 2020년도에 출판이 되었고, 그리고 캠브리지 대학교에서 2022년도에 캠브리지 핸드북 오브 트랜슬레이션, 캠브리지 번역 핸드북도 출판하신 바 있습니다. 네, 자 그러면 Kirsten 교수님을 따뜻한 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Kirsten Malmkjaer.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I'm sure it was very, very nice. Thank you. And thank you also for inviting me to this very interesting event. I've learned such a lot already. I am going to talk to the title that you see up there, Language, Translation and Empathy. And I shall begin by showing you what I hope to be the structure of my talk. So my talk will have 7 parts, and you can see that begins with an introduction, and then I'll talk a bit about the relationship between language and translation, and perception, I mean. Then I'll move on to talk about the theory of mind and empathy, and then I'll talk about emotion, empathy, and translation. I'll move on to talk about translating without empathy, and then an example of translation with empathy, and then I'll end with a conclusion. So I shall begin with part 1, which is going to be the introduction. And here you see the remarkable explorer Thor Heyerdahl, who is probably best known for his 8,000-kilometer-long Kon-Tiki expedition, which he undertook by hand-built raft across the Pacific Ocean in 1947 from South America to the Tuamotu Islands. He was and remains a controversial figure for a number of reasons, some personal and others to do with his scientific claims, which according to some scholars were pseudoscientific and based on selective uses of sources. And here you see Thor Heyerdahl on his way on his raft, and here you see the raft itself. So this was a copy made of the kinds of ship that he thought people had used in the past. But I want to talk about, use him to introduce my talk because of a remark that he is said to have made, which was, borders, I've never seen one, but I've heard that they exist in the minds of some people. Now I realize that being in the place where we are, and also in the context of what's going on in the world at the moment, that might seem very naive. But of course, he was talking about borders in a metaphorical sense, and that is indeed how I will talk about borders as well. I'd like to explore the borders of the mind by way of issues that are pertinent to my academic discipline, which is translation studies. And my argument is going to be that an obvious border between peoples is a lack of understanding of each other's languages, and that translation is an obvious but not unproblematic bridge across this border, if there are bridges across borders, indeed. And I'll use an illustration through art, as benefits the third sub-theme of this conference, unity through empathy, which is founded on the belief that through art we can empathize with others and the world, and I think we can indeed do that. The reason I want to use translation as a focus is because, in an important sense, we translate the speech of each other in every linguistic encounter, even if it seems as if only one language is involved, and for that reason, when we look at translation as such, we can learn a great deal about how we interact in everyday linguistic encounters. I'm going to end my talk with an example of a translation for which the translator has had to exercise his ability to empathize considerably in order to produce a translation of a text made by a person who herself, unlike her translator, will have been fairly far from the subject matter in terms of emphatic ability. But before we get that far, I thought it might be helpful to dwell for a while on the relationship between language and perception. So I'll move on to talk about that now. Now, it is a commonplace of this relationship that there are usually many different ways to describe an event, but that one of these different ways of describing the event has to be chosen, given that you can only say one thing at a time, so to speak. So if we take this example, consider this picture, which is showing you a piece of the world, let us say. And there are 4 different ways that I've suggested here that you might be able to describe that image. You can either say the club is to the left of the ball, or the ball is to the right of the club, or to the left of the ball is the club, and to the right of the ball is to the club is the ball, depending on which point of view you're adopting. But each of these descriptions is as accurate as any of the others, given a particular state of affairs in the world. The description you select is going to depend on a number of things, most obviously whether you adopt the point of view of the club or the ball or the position, but also whether you adopt the position of the onlooker viewing the picture or the position of the player depicted. Now, in real life, this kind of situation is usually dealt with, let us say, in a cake shop, when you explain to the person on the other side of the counter, for example, I'd like the one to your right, which would be the one to the customer's left, of course, because the customer is usually facing the seller. But the customer who says, I would like the one to your right, is adopting the point of view of the seller and thereby avoiding confusion about which item is wanted. But equally, sometimes we need to know the circumstances surrounding an utterance in order to interpret it. Consider the utterance, nice ball, said in the context where a child is playing with a colorful ball, or in a circumstance where a football game spectator is commenting on how a player kicks a football. Now, this is not a matter of ambiguity, such as we see between ball as an object and ball as a dance event. It's more a matter of polysemy. That is relatedness of meaning of the term ball in the 2 different contexts. And finally, Finally, let me consider an example that will take us to the third section of my talk. This is the illustration through art that I promised you. Here's one work of art, and here's another work of art. I think that if we simply juxtapose those two pictures, we can see a bit of a similarity between them in terms of the red color, but really, other than that, they have very little in common. But if we show them with their titles, that is, with some linguistic information, then we can begin to see more of a relationship between them. This first picture is entitled Saint Jerome in Meditation, and it was made in 1605 by the Italian painter Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. I must mention in passing that Saint Jerome was the patron saint, is still the patron saint of translators, so it's very pertinent to use this picture. Now, if we have the linguistic information that the title of the painting provides, then we might begin to build up a story about how this first picture relates to the second picture. The second picture is entitled Saint Jerome in Mediation, and it's made in about sometime in the 2010s by Thomas Downes. Putting them together, we can then think, was Saint Jerome moving the beard in the first picture and hanging on the crook in the second picture? And in addition to this sequential story that we can make up from the juxtaposed paintings, given the title that Downes has given his painting, we might also meditate on the meaning of mediation and meditation. Now, the most prominent meaning for mediation that I have found on an internet search that I undertook has to do with dispute resolution by way of a mediating person. But the meaning that I think we need to look at is among the others listed, namely to bring about a result such as a physiological effect. This is the opposite of meditation, because in meditation you do nothing except meditate. Sorry, back. As you can see there, meditation is defined as a practice in which an individual uses a technique such as mindfulness or focusing the mind on a particular object, thought, or activity to train attention and awareness and to achieve a mentally clear and emotionally calm and stable state. And that's a definition that I found in our good friend Wikipedia. As I suggested, since Jerome is holding on to his beard in the original painting, as he meditates, perhaps his meditation concerns the beard. And for example, whether he should shave it off or sacrifice it or whatever. In any case, once we know the title of the painting, we probably begin to wonder what is in St. Jerome's mind. You know, he is in meditation after all. And this takes me to part 3 of my talk, which is entitled Theory of Mind and Empathy. According to Sir Simon Baron-Cohen, what enables people to attribute mental states such as beliefs, emotions, desires, hopes, and fears to themselves and to others, and to interpret behaviors in terms of mental states is a theory of mind. So you work out what is in your own mind, you work out what is in other people's mind, you have a theory that there is a mind in there. And the theory of mind, or mind reading, as Baron-Cohen also sometimes calls it, is a prerequisite for empathy. It enables a person to identify another person's experience. If that is all that a person can do, then their ability to empathize is limited to what Reynolds refers to as cognitive empathy. But to actually feel another's emotions, maybe to the extent of coming to share the other person's mental states, requires an additional type of empathy, according to Baron-Cohen, which he calls affective empathy. So in summary, to sum this part up, there are 2 kinds of empathy: cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Let us consider now whether these types of empathy are necessary for translating. I think myself that whereas cognitive empathy, identifying and understanding what other people are thinking and feeling, certainly is necessary for translating. But I'm not sure about affective empathy. Does a translator need to feel the other's pain or the other's joy in order to convey it in their translation? And I'm not sure about that. But a translator certainly has to identify other people's emotional experiences and know how to encourage those emotional experiences in their new audience for the translation. Now, the reason that I got interested in this issue in the first place is that emotion has made its way into translation studies in rather a sort of noticeable way by way of a book by an author called Severine Hübscher-Davidson. And according to her, there are three distinctive areas where emotions influence translators. First of all, there's emotional material contained in the source texts. Secondly, the translator's own emotions. And thirdly, the emotions of source and target readers. Now, some scholars have questioned the idea of emotional material contained in the source text, because while humans are sentient beings who have emotions, texts are just text and are not in themselves sentient. But while it's true that a formulation like Hübscher-Davidson's emotional material in the source text, which probably reflects how we talk about emotions a lot of the time in the context of literature, although that way of speaking may be misleading, it is widely accepted in psychology that texts may imitate or represent life, and for example, a play or a novel allows us to compare an explicitly simulated set of actions and their results with emotions that are our own and that may move us considerably. Now, in the context of art, views like that represent what is known as expression theories of art. The artist is thought to feel an emotion that he or she transmits to the audience by way of the work. So if we consider a translation to be a work of art, as I do, then we might suggest that the translator feels an emotion engendered by the work to be translated, which he or she seeks to transmit to the reader of the translation by way of the translation. As well as being an expression theory, this is also an arousal theory, because the claim is that the source text gives rise to an emotion in the translator. This can't be assumed to be the case in all issues of translation, because it's possible for a translator to feel no effect resulting from the work that he or she is translating, just as, after all, many celebrated artists have expressly denied that emotion lay at the heart of their endeavors. However, to return to the idea that a translator might experience an emotion when reading a source text, and that he or she would like to engender the same emotion in readers of his or her translation, translators themselves do testify to this. For example, Boas Bayer and de Vught put it in this way: translation is never about getting it right, about approximating the form or content of the original, about making a copy for those who do not speak Yiddish or Latvian or French. It's about recognizing someone else's story, understanding the way the teller has chosen to tell it, and passing it on to others. And let us consider now what can happen to translation in the absence of a theory of mind, in the absence of an interest in the reactions of others. Here we might focus on a young man, not so young anymore, but was a young man when the book about him was written, called Christopher Taylor. He was born in January 1962, and he has been documented with great sympathy and empathy indeed in a book by Neil Smith and Yanthi Maria Simply, entitled The Mind of a Savant, Language Learning and Modularity. When the book was published in 1995, Christopher Taylor would have been 33 years old. And as they explain, Christopher is unique He's institutionalized because he's unable to look after himself. He has difficulty in finding his way around. He has poor hand-eye coordination, turning many everyday tasks such as shaving or doing up buttons into a burdensome chore. But he can read, write, and communicate in any of 15 to 20 languages. And you can look up Christopher Taylor with Neil Smith on the internet, on YouTube, and you can see him perform there. And Christopher can also translate, but they explain Christopher's translating abilities, although remarkable in terms of speed, are unusually flawed in terms of sensitivity to contextual information and linguistic constraints. For example, when asked to translate the English source text, "Would you like to speak German?" into German, Christopher produces "Möchten Sie sprechen Deutsch?" Even though if he's given a formal test, he demonstrates that he knows the appropriate translation would be "Möchten Sie Deutsch sprechen?" A similar example is Christopher's translation of "Can you give me more time?", where he produces "Können Sie mir geben mehr Zeit?", whereas the correct translation is "Können Sie mir mehr Zeit geben?". And Smith and Simply comment, Christopher stops short at the word recognition stage and provides a translation on a purely word-for-word basis, even though he may have the requisite knowledge to do better. They go on, Christopher speaks English in many different languages, although he knows in well-formedness judgments, or if you ask him whether a sentence is formed correctly, he knows the correct syntax of those languages. So what is happening is that Christopher displays a theory of mind deficit, although his linguistic competence is intact in English. For Christopher, translation is a non-communicative enterprise, a linguistic exercise. So his case illustrates by its absence the importance in translation of a theory of mind, of consideration of the other, and in that sense of empathy. And I will move on now to talk about translating with empathy. And I'd ask you to consider the translation made by an adult male translator of a literary work written by a female child. This is the case of the translation into Danish of The Young Visitors of Mr. Saltena's Plan, which was written by Daisy Ashford in 1890 when she was 9 years old. The source text was published in 1919 in London by Chatto and Windus, and it was reprinted 18 times in the first year of its publication. There's also a film version, which you can look at on the internet. The Young Visitors of Mr. Saltena's Plan is an unusual work insofar as the narrating voice is that of a 9-year-old female child. And you see her there, who is also the actual author. She really did write the book. And this is in contrast to many books published in English, as if written by children. They're actually authored by adults. For example, there's a whole series of books by Dame Jacqueline Wilson, who has written about a character called Tracy Beaker, and she makes Tracy Beaker tell the story. It's also true of the Adrian Mole books by Sue Townsend. So these books have required an adult author to assume how a child would write. And then any translator of the work into any other language would presumably convey this adult-made child's voice to the new language. But I'm not going to talk about those books anymore because I haven't looked at them in translation. But in contrast to those books, The Young Visitors of Mr. Saltena's Plan is written by an actual English child. So its translator's task is to try to write as a real child would write. One issue that the translator might consider might be whether the translation should be written as a child in the translator's culture would write, or whether the impression that the child is English should remain in the translation. Now, the Danish translator says that he has striven to present the world that Daisy Ashford created in a country house in England in the 90s, that's the 1890s. And he retains the English titles Mr. and Miss for the characters. So it's clear that the action in the translation still takes place in England. For a Danish audience, this isn't too alien because quite a lot of literature from England, written in English, is translated into Danish and people read it quite happily. There's the film. The translation into Danish is titled De unge elskende, eller Mr. Saltenas plan. And that means the young lovers, or Mr. Saltena's plan. The word elskende, lovers, is a misspelling, but it's been left in the title. And this translation was published in 1986 by Nyt Nordisk Forlag Arnold Busk A.S. And here is a picture of the translator. As I mentioned a little while ago, The Young Visitors was written in 1890, and the translation was published in 1986, so that is almost a century later. And as the translator remarks, the main problem with the translation was the Zeitgeist, tidsånden in Danish, the spirit of the time in English. And he goes on, I haven't tried to match a 90s Danish as a 9-year-old girl would misunderstand it. I've used concrete expressions from the era in descriptions of clothing and objects, but in descriptive parts, as well as in the dialogue, I have moved the language toward our own time as gently as I could. The narration is mainly third-person narrative, so it begins, Mr. Saltena was an elderly man of 42 and was fond of asking people to stay with him. The narrator self-refers occasionally when addressing her readers, as in chapter 1, where she suggests that perhaps my readers will be wondering why Bernard Clark had asked Mr. Saltena to stay with him. Now this occasional direct address to readers is fairly common as a literary device in third-person narratives, and I suppose some of us might know it particularly famously from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre's exclamation, "Reader, I married him." And Daisy Ashford uses this technique with panache. Especially good examples of her skills in using this literary device are the endings of chapter 2. Here, we'll leave our friends to unpack and end this chapter. And in chapter 3, so I will end my chapter, and so on. I'll skip the rest of these examples until the last one. So now, my readers, we'll say farewell to the characters in this book, The End by Daisy Ashford. Now, of course, Daisy Ashford's familiarity with literary convention is great, but despite this, she is a child, and she adopts a child's perspective on many parts of the story that she tells. For example, in chapter 1, where she introduces and describes her main characters, she explains that Ethel Montague, who is 17 years old, wears a blue velvet frock which had grown rather short in the sleeves. And at the beginning of chapter 2, which takes place on the morning of Ethel's and Mr. Saltena's journey by train to visit Bernard, she explains that when the great morning came, Mr. Saltena did not have an egg for his breakfast in case he should be sick on the journey. You can sort of hear Daisy Ashford's mother telling her not to eat too much for breakfast if she's going somewhere there. When the travellers arrive at Bernard's estate, they are offered a glorious tea on a gold tray, 2 kinds of bread and butter, a lovely jam roll, and lots of sugar cakes. As these passages illustrate, and as the translator into Danish notes, Daisy Ashford was very good at spelling, but she was only 9 years old, and it's quite understandable that her text exhibits a selection of errors. Now, unusually for published texts, these errors have been retained in the translation, or in the publication, and they have been replicated to an extent in the translation. This is unusual for child literature, because if you look on the internet where you have sites where children's original work have been published, those works seem improbably error-free. But as I said, in this book that we're talking about here, The Young Visitors, the errors have been retained. And I guess that they contribute considerably to the effect that people might feel when they read the book. It might heighten the empathy that they might feel for the characters. The translator sees them as curiosities which must certainly not detract from the book's genuine qualities. Let them rather enter into a higher magical unity in Daisy Ashford's world, created in a nursery, in a house in the English countryside in the 1890s, and what a world. Now, Daisy Ashford perforce adopts a child's perspective on emotions and is unfamiliar from personal experience with the emotions that she is aware that her characters are likely to experience, given the situations that they find themselves in. She knows these emotions by description rather than by acquaintance, as we might say with Bertrand Russell, whose own example is of the taste of cheese. We can know cheese as an object, but we can never know cheese properly unless we've actually tasted it, he says. So, Daisy Ashford focuses on the outer manifestations of the character's inner feelings, as when Mr. Saltena and Ethel arrive at Bernard's house, and Mr. Saltena says to Bernard, "Let me introduce Miss Montague. She's very pleased to come for this visit." "Oh yes," gasped Ethel, blushing through her red rouge. Bernard looked at her keenly and turned a dark red. The translator doesn't mention this as a difficulty, and indeed, as an adult, he finds himself in the fortunate position, which is rather unusual for a translator, of knowing more about what's being narrated than the author does, as far as this issue is concerned. And therefore his task is to avoid allowing this more advanced knowledge and experience to filter through to the translation, because this would risk superimposing an ironic tone on the work which might diminish its effective potential. Now it's obvious that the translator empathizes positively with the author, and his emotional engagement with the work is made clear in his translator's notes, where he says, "One of life's plentiful pleasures is the completion of a piece of enjoyable work. In the case of the translation of Daisy Ashford's novel, however, my joy was admixed with grief that the book wasn't longer, that it ended, that my work was not to continue." And one of the interesting things about his translation, as I've hinted already, is that he populates his translation with the kinds of error that a Danish child of 9 might make in the Danish language. Now, given the lexical differences between the languages, this strategy means that instead of making an error in the item in the translation that corresponds to an item that Daisy Ashford had spelled incorrectly, the translator often selects a different item in the translation to render erroneously, namely one that a Danish child might find difficult. These errors have to be believable, logical, and consistent in the context of the language of the translation, which means, interestingly, that the representation of spelling errors works best when close equivalence with individual items in the source text in this aspect is avoided rather than aimed for. For example, in the first sentence of the story, Mr. Saltena is said to be fond of asking people to stay with him. And this term that I put in red there, people, is the first misspelling in the book. The translator, though, places an error in the chapter heading instead, where he spells the term temmelig, which would correspond to the original's quite a young girl, as temlig, which is how the term is usually pronounced. And this kind of consistency in misspelling is important to ensure credibility across the translation. And the translator further ensures credibility by exploiting other aspects of the Danish spelling system where pronunciation is either imprecise or a misleading guide to spelling, or vice versa. In particular, within words, the same consonantal sounds can be represented by either double G or single G or double or single K, and that either of those might represent the spoken sound G. The DT example there, both may represent the spoken sound D, and so on, as you can see. Some vowel sounds can be represented with different letters as well. This is very common in languages, including English, that spelling is not necessarily pronunciation is not necessarily a very good guide to spelling. And now I'll conclude. Because empathy belongs within the realm of what Austin refers to as perlocution, which is the effect that a speech act has on the listener, what it makes the listener what it makes the listener understand, feel, or do, this is not in the translator's power any more than it's actually in the power of the author of the original to guarantee to be replicated on the readership's part. But a translator will, if they wish to convey to the readers of the translation the effect of the original had on themselves, seek to select the translation for individual items that will, together, in the translator's opinion, convey that effect to the readers of the translation. Their success in this endeavor depends, at least to an extent, on the degree to which they are able to develop a theory of mind for the author and for the audience for the translation. I think that the notion of a theory of mind is a prerequisite and even an enabler of what has been referred to by Christiane Nord as loyalty, which she defines as the responsibility that translators have towards their partners, where by partners she means the source text or the client or themselves. Now, Nord uses the idea of loyalty to swing the focus in translating away from an exclusive concentration on linguistic and stylistic similarity between the source text and the translation, regardless of the communicative intentions or expectations involved. So clearly being loyal in Nord's sense involves having some idea about the minds of others. And this is an important insight because, in fact, every act, as I said to begin with, every act of common interactive speech is translating between the parties involved, even if they use the same language. So the important role that empathy plays in translation is equally as vital for all the parties involved in any speech event. It's important for them to pay attention to the mindset, that is, to the form of a theory of mind for each other, and to consider it in any negotiations that they enter into. And this, I think, is quite an important lesson that we might learn by considering translation studies, even though we're only using one language. And this is all I have to say on the topic for now. Thank you very much for listening.
네. 이번 세계인문학 포럼의 대주제 중에 하나인 공감과 번역이 어떤 식으로 연관이 될 수 있는지를 아주 명확하게 잘 발표를 해주셨습니다. 감사합니다. 자, 그래서 저희가 지금 시간이 많이 없지만 플로어에서 질문이 있으시면 한 두 질문 정도, 2개 질문 정도 받도록 하겠습니다. 혹시 질문이 있으신가요? 네, 질문이 없으시면 제가 하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 그 영어로 질문을 하도록 하겠습니다. So I have two questions actually. You already showed us very beautiful 2 artworks, and then I was wondering if the artist Thomas Downs is the one that I know of.
Yes, It is the artist that you know. Okay, so this is my son who drew that painting of Saint Jerome's beard. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. The second question is, the original book, which was written by a 9-year-old child, was translated into Danish, and then the title was a little bit changed. The original one was The Young Visitor, and then that has been changed into Danish as The Young Lovers. And then why do you think so? Is there any reason for that?
Well, the only reason I can think of, and I haven't asked the translator, is that somehow The Young Lovers, if that was translated into Danish, would not collocate particularly well. Sorry, the young visitors would not collocate very well in Danish, whereas The Young Lovers does. So it's, I think it's a linguistic issue.
제가 이 질문을 드린 이유는 그 원래 원전은 영어로 쓰여져 있는데 9살짜리 소녀가 그 소설을 썼다고 합니다. 근데 원래 제목이 The Young Visitors라고 해서 한국어로는 그 어린 방문객들이라고 표현이 되는데 덴마크어로는 왜 이것이 The Young Lovers에서 그 어린 그 연인들이라고 이렇게 번역이 됐는지를 제가 여쭤보니까 덴마크어로는 어린 방문객이라는 어떤 이런 표현이 좀 잘 맞지 않아서 young lovers 이렇게 표현을 했다고 합니다. 그래서 사실 우리 한국어 같은 경우에도 제가 한번 생각을 해봤는데 제가 번역이 전공이라서 그런지 모르겠지만 그 우리 정서에는 어린 연인이라는 거가 조금 더 맞지 않는 것 같은 그런 느낌이 들어서 오히려 한국 정서에는 그 어린 방문객이라고 하는 것이 조금 더 좋지 않나 이런 생각이 들어서 네 여쭤봤습니다. Okay, thank you. Please give her a big round of applause. 감사합니다. 선생님께 큰 박수 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다. 네.